let's begin this session. Here I invite Dr. Jaya Gupta, Dr. Shreyas Ramamurthy, Dr. Ramendra Bakshi, Dr. Rajiv Bajaj, Dr. Ritin Goyal, and Dr. Piyush Kapoor. Thank you, and now we can start our session. Thank you.
Hi everyone. I believe all are in, or we are still waiting for Dr. Ritin and Dr. Shreyas to come in.
Yes, I think they've still not logged in. I don't see.
Yeah.
Good evening, everybody, and I thank AIOS for inviting me over here. Hi, Piyush. Let's start the session. Yes.
Hi, Raminder. How are you?
Hello, sir. I'm good. How are you, sir?
All fine. So all are ready with the talks. I think we are basically the aim of this session is to just talk about the basics of refractive surgery, which is more relevant for the general ophthalmologist to know the various aspects in refractive surgery, like what generally the patients and the ophthalmologist encounter in their day-to-day life. Dr. Jaya would be talking about the pentacam dilemmas, which is the first step to step in and start a refractive surgery. Further, it would be enumerated, or I would believe strengthened by Dr. Shreyas, talking about the biomechanics, which is the next step ahead beyond pentacam in the cases where we are a little dubious or in a gray area of pentacam. Dr. Raminder would start with her talk about surface ablation, which I believe was the stepping stone for keratorefractive surgery to begin with, though in between PRK or the surface ablation had gone down and LASIK had picked up much more. But again, the era is back, which I believe Raminder would agree that the smart surface ablation or the newer conception surface ablation have come back into action. And the gist would be discussed about Dr. Rajiv Bajaj, who would talk about, in general, what are the general trends, how to go about in planning the procedure for a patient, whether to go in for a surface ablation, a LASIK, or a SMILE, because he's one of the stalwarts to have all the facilities at his center which are at his disposal under one roof. Dr. Ritin is a user of Contura, which is an introduction through Alcon, though these days we think we have heard a lot about Contura, patients coming in and talking about Contura day in and day out, and they have different concepts about Contura. And even most of the ophthalmologists who are actually not using Contura do not know the real details, how Contura is working, how good it is, and what is the real use of the technology, where to use it and where to avoid. I myself would be talking about the ICLs in the area or in the patients with the very high ametropia in cases where LASIK is generally not preferred. So do you think we should start, or we should wait for Ritin and Shreyas to log in?
No, I think we should start. They can.
Okay.
They can join it later on. Yes, we should start.
Okay. Yeah. So Dr. Jaya would begin with the pentacam dilemmas.
Yes.
Over to you, Dr. Jaya.
Thank you. I thank the AIOS and Dr. Piyush for giving me this opportunity. I'll begin with my screen share. So my screen is visible?
Yes, it's visible. Yes.
So I begin this session of keratorefractive surgery. Just a second. Shreyas is trying to call me. Hello, Shreyas? Okay. I'll just put it in the group to send you the link. Okay. I just am extremely sorry. Actually, I need to inform Shreyas for the Zoom link. Can someone do that? He's saying he doesn't have the link for our session.
I think the link sent to us by AIOS was very specific to the speaker.
No, I think in the hall.
Dr. Jaya, I'll send Mohit. He will just coordinate with you.
Okay, okay. So
You can
just
begin with your
ask
talk.
him.
He's coming down to you.
I think I've already put it in the group, and let's see who's able to do it. So I begin this session of keratorefractive surgery, what and why, revising our pentacam basics and discussing some of the case scenarios. So corneal topographers are indispensable tool in the evaluation of refractive surgeries. It's based on the Scheimpflug principle. The pentacam has two integrated cameras, one camera to detect the size and orientation of the pupil and control fixation. The second camera is mounted on the rotating wheel to take pictures of the cornea and the anterior segment. This is a refractive, so we begin straight away with the analysis. This is a refractive quad map printout in which we see the different areas. We'll be discussing each of them a little in detail. We begin with looking at the quality of the scan, which should be okay, below which we see the Q value. The Q value is a measure of asphericity of the cornea. Within the central 6 mm zone, the value varies from -1 to 0. In a normal sphere, the Q would be 0, whereas in a normal cornea, which is prolate, the value is in minus. After myopic ablation, it would become oblate, and there the value becomes in plus. So most of the refractive surgeons would start by looking at the pachymetry maps. A value less than 4 cm needs further analysis of the maps. Now we look at the difference of the thinnest point with the apex. Anything greater than 10 microns is a red flag. The difference in thinnest pachy between the two eyes should be less than 30 microns. Anything beyond is again needs further analysis. I'll tell you about the angle kappa here. The angle kappa is the angle between the visual axis and the axis that passes through the pupil center. Clinical trials have shown that the visual axis passes somewhere in between the pupil center and the apex of the cornea and might be half the distance. So the number of the x coordinate should be less than 200. Anything beyond 200 means a decentered pupil and a significant angle kappa. The next is the y coordinate. The y coordinate, or the location of the thinnest location, should be less than 500 microns, and anything more than that means some abnormality. Next, what should I look by looking at the elevation maps, the shape, and the parameter? First, look at the check the miscellaneous settings for elevations, which can be any of these. But the ideal diameter of the best fit reference body is 8 mm, and the ideal float is the float mode. Now, in the elevation map, this is a symmetrical sandy watch or an hourglass saddle pattern. Here we see a tongue or an island shape, which is a red flag. Then the elevation maps have got certain numerical values. In these values, on the anterior elevation, anything beyond 15 micron, and in the posterior elevation, anything beyond 20 micron in the 6 mm zone is a red flag. We also look at the difference of the central peak elevation back and elevation front, which should not be more than 10 microns. Anything beyond 10 is a red flag. The sagittal maps gives us the actual power of the cornea. The different patterns I'll be discussing later. Here we can see a symmetric bow tie, the two lobes A and B, which we can know how much are they, what is the skew between them. And this skewing, anything beyond 22 degrees is a significant risk factor for ectasia. Borderline irregularities, if they mirror in both the corneas, which is called as enantiomorphism, can be accepted. We look at the different keratometric values. These keratometric values, which like K1 is the flat K, K2 is the steep K, M is the mean keratometric power, and then we have the K max, which is the maximum keratometric power on the anterior surface of the cornea. On the sagittal maps further, a K max value beyond 48 is a red flag. Here we can see in the different maps the K max. And a Kmax difference between the two eyes should be less than 2 diopters. The different patterns that I just discussed would be round, oval, symmetric bow tie, a superior steepening or an inferior steepening. Here we see an asymmetric bow tie with a superior steepening, and here we see an asymmetric bow tie with an inferior steepening. So anything beyond 1.5 diopter in inferior steepening or anything beyond 2.5 diopter in superior steepening is again a red flag. The tangential maps have more relevance to the cornea surgeons, which helps us to know the irregularity or the cone pattern. Post-refractive surgery, to know the ablation, how well it is centered, the tangential maps can be used. And this is how the tangential map of would look like. It's a more noisy map. Coming on to the Bellin-Ambrosio display, which can be divided into two segments, the topography segment and the pachymetry section. The topography segment consists of 3 rows. The first row is of elevation map. The second is the exclusion maps. And the third is the difference map. The pachymetry section will be dealt later. So in a keratoconic cornea, it would actually steepen the best width sphere, thus making the cone less obvious. So what the Pentacam does is it isolates 3.5 to 4 millimeter of this location, and that's the enhanced best width sphere. And in the third row, we get a difference map from the normal and the enhanced best width sphere. Schematically, this is the best width sphere. And once we have isolated this thinnest location, so that's the enhanced best width sphere, making the cone more obvious. And then in the last row where the difference map is there, which comes as flagged in the anterior surface as beyond 7 is flat, and in the posterior surface beyond 16 is again a red flag. Now in the pachymetry maps, in the pachymetry section, we saw 2 graphs. The first was the corneal thickness spatial profile graph, which displays the sequence of pachymetry values along concentric circles of increasing diameter beginning at and centered on the corneal thinnest point. So the red curve that we see should fall between this black dotted lines. If it falls before the 6 mm zone, then that's a red flag. So this is a normal eye. We can have a quick slope or an S shape in form crust or keratoconus, flat shape in an edematous cornea, or an inverted shape as in PMD. So the percentage thickness increase again measures the percentage pachymetric increase starting from the thinnest point over concentric hemimeridia throughout the 360 degree. So this is again abnormal. Coming on to the progression index, the progression index or the pachymetry progression index is calculated for all hemimeridia over the entire 360 degree of the cornea, starting from the thinnest point. And here we see a minimum value and the maximum value, which is shown by this green arrow and the blue arrow. And this value has been calculated to be less than 1. Anything beyond 1.2 is again a red flag. It also gives us the ART max, the Ambrosio's relation thickness maximum, which is a ratio between the thinnest pachymetry and the pachymetry progression index. The value from the normative data has been said to be 385. Anything less than this is suspect. The D values, total D beyond 2.6 comes as a flagged red. Earlier, the maps were having the different D values would be DF, DB, DP, DT, and DY. We will not go into the details of each, but DY was there in the earlier maps. Now the newer maps have DA, which is deviation of the ART max. The D is not does not indicate an abnormal eye. The large D is not a parameter; it's a regression analysis using all the parameters against a database of 1,200 eyes. Now, quickly, I'll go through some of the case scenarios. Like this is a 21-year male where we can see in the AR has a slender of -9.25 and an acceptance of -4. This is the Pentacam, the quad map, and this is the Bellin-Ambrosio. So it's very clear a case of keratoconus where we can see that the posterior elevation, which is showing beyond 60 microns, the symmetric otai, but all in steep keratometry values. This is the left eye. Now, the second case that I have put is of a 28-year female having a very normal refraction of -3.25 in the right eye and -3.75 with -0.5 in the left eye. So this is the quad map and this is the Bellin-Ambrosio. So in the Bellin-Ambrosio, what are the suspect things we look? We look at the, in this particular map, like we see the progressive index, the ART max, we see here the graph dipping down, and these suspect D values. So in this case, we would like to wait. This is of the left eye. Now, a third situation, this is a 26-year female, which has having a stable pentacam and a stable refraction of 1.75 with -2, and in the light type, -2 with -1.5. We can see a similar art display, but now look at the quad. In the quad map, I'd like to bring your attention to the cornea. Here we see a value of 10.9. So this is a small cornea. In a small cornea, because of more cornea volume, some of these values come flat. So we have to analyze the maps in totality, keeping all the factors in mind. Similar for the left eye, a flagged bad display, but again, look at the cornea, 10.8. Now, case 4, this is a 31-year female with a refraction of -6 cylinder in the right eye and -4.5 cylinder in the left eye. This is what the quad map looks like, looks fairly okay. But look at the Kmax over here, it shows 50 diopters. So a Kmax of 50 diopters does not essentially mean that it's a keratophonic eye. My case number 5, which is a 23-year female, which has been referred to rule out keratoconus, and she has a refraction of 1 diopter sphere in the right eye, -3.25 cylinder in the left eye. This is what her map looks like. We see an inferior steeping in the posterior elevation. We again see values of 70. The bad display, this is the left eye. But look at the cornea. You see an inferior scar in both the eyes, which explains all the abnormalities that we were seeing.
Ma'am, apologies for the interruption, but I request you to please sum it up in.
Okay, then I'll submit it because I was delayed initially because of some error by one of my Okay.
Yeah, ma'am, no issues.
Okay, so I'll sum it up.
Oh, yeah, thank you so much, ma'am. Thanks.
Thank you. So I'll stop my screen share as well.
Dr. Jaya, thanks for beautifully presenting all the pentacam dilemmas, and you have very nicely illuminated the way we have to look at a pentacam before proceeding on for a keratorefractive surgery. But of course, as you were sharing a few cases where the dilemma exists, like the scarred ones and all, which showed those gray areas of pentacam, I would like Dr. Shreyas to further enumerate how biomechanics helps in just deciding about the refractive surgery in these patients, how useful the mechanism is, and what is the practicality involved in it. Dr. Shreyas, please.
At the outset, thank you so much, sir, for inviting me and having me over this IC. And it's truly a pleasure being there with all of you. So today my talk in this is really going to be highlighting initially about biomechanics, and then talking to you all about how it is making a difference in our day-to-day refractive practice. I'll try to bring in some literature, some basic points, as well as some practical points towards the end. So the need is, we definitely need better screening criteria. Dr. Jaya presented a wonderful talk on pentacam, which is still remains the gold standard. Most of us follow that as the basic for screening any case. But can we go beyond it? Now, as we are moving more towards from tomography, as we are reaching the apex of tomography, we are trying to see if there is a greater emphasis on biomechanics, especially with the advent of SMILE, combined procedures with cross-linking, which are saying that biomechanically it could be superior. Can we actually test these procedures using biomechanics? While all the Scheimpflug devices that we have, the Pentacam, Galili, are all excellent, they are very, very good in differentiating normal from keratoconic eyes. But we are not really looking at differentiating normal from keratoconic eyes. We are really looking at differentiating normal from form thrust keratoconus, which continues to remain a challenge, because the definition of form thrust keratoconus itself is a challenge. And I'll allude to that briefly in the next part of the presentation. So corneal biomechanics, essentially, it is just based on the deformation of the cornea to an air puff. And initially it was Ora, it is now we are using the Corvus. And this dynamic from how a cornea changes when this is a normal cornea based on the air puff, you can see it has an initial flattening and then a slight concavity and then returns back to normal. This dynamic response is what we measure and through which various indices are brought in. This is a keratoconic eye. You can see that the deformation is much more prolonged, and the amplitude itself is much greater. So essentially what we are seeing is, from a normal state, from the initial convex state, it retains a flat stage, which is called applanation 1. And based on that, we measure that applanation length. And then it goes on to a concavity. And this concavity is from the highest concavity to the normal state is what we measure as the deflection amplitude, the amount it has deflected. The curvature along of the deflection itself is called the bend radius, and the inverse of that is called the inverse corneal radius. I'm not going to bore you all with too many technical details, but suffice to say that based on this is what the entire Corvus is based on, and all the indices are based on this basic measurement. It also gives us IOP and pachymetry, and also a biomechanically adjusted IOP, which is also very, very useful. This is the basic screen of the dynamic corneal response. Like I said, it gives you the deformation amplitude, and then it also gives you an important ratio. That is the center, the area which gets deformed maximum, and the ratio to the 2 millimeter from the center, which is the DA ratio, which is also very, very important. So a greater deformation amplitude, a shorter applanation length, and a higher DA ratio, and a higher inverse corneal radius are all indicative of a softer or weaker cornea. The newer report which has come into Corvus is the Vinciguerra screening report. And this Vinciguerra screening report has 4 major criteria and then gives a single index called the Corvus biomechanical index. This Corvus biomechanical index has the DA ratio at 1 and 2 millimeter. It has something called the integrated radius. Then you have the ARTS, the Ambrosio's relational thickness to the horizontal profile, and an SPA1, a nominal stiffness parameter, which has been brought about by Dr. Cynthia Roberts. And each of these parameters have a particular weightage to give you what we call the CBI, Corvus biomechanical index. I can go into each of these parameters, but since many of us are not using Corvus, it may not be very useful. But suffice to say that the CBI is a very sensitive and important index to be kept in mind. It also gives you a stress strain index. So the stress strain index is actually a curve of a stress to strain. Normally, we were only measuring it in vitro, but now there is an in vivo measurement which is available. So essentially, whenever it is moving to the right, a value of greater than 1, it's a stronger cornea. A value lesser than 1 is a softer cornea. The normal value is close to 1. So this is just an example of a patient with an absolutely normal pentacam, and normal overall D was in the white, and everything is in the bad display is normal. But when you look at the CBI, it is quite high. It's very, very abnormal. So when you look at the other eye, the fellow eye of this patient, this was significant keratoconus. And this is yet another example of a patient where the one eye was absolutely normal, other eye had keratoconus, but CBI was abnormal in both the eyes. So the biomechanics in the seemingly normal pentacam is also abnormal. And this brought about the first paper by Vinciguerra, where they looked at 12 eyes of what was perceived as unilateral KC, that is KC in one eye, but the other eye is tomographically normal. And this is actually our definition of form first keratoconus. That is, a patient does not have KC tomographically, or doesn't have any specific signs in that eye. So it's only abnormal biomechanics. Now, with the combination of Corvus, we also are able to combine it with the pentacam, and we have another index called the TBI, the tomographic biomechanical index. The tomographic biomechanical index has been shown to be even more sensitive than the CBI. So you have the CBI, the bad D, and the TBI. And if you look at the ROC curves, a cutoff of 0.79 of the TBI has been found to be 100% sensitive and 100% specific in picking up cases of form first keratoconus. So this was a very important landmark study where they compared the bad D performance versus CBI versus TBI. Here, getting 480 normals, 204 keratoconus is fine, but it is these 94 eyes which really make a difference. These 94 eyes are patients where they have ectasia in one eye, but the fellow eye is absolutely normal. So let us look at the performance of each of these indices in differentiating the two. So here mainly you want to differentiate between the normal and the seemingly normal tomographic eye of the very asymmetric ectasia fellow eye. Bad D, if you see, it is almost similar to that of a normal. It is not able to differentiate. If you look at the CBI, it is easily able to differentiate KC and very asymmetric ectasia. But when you look at the fellow eye of the very asymmetric ectasia, it is able to differentiate, but the spread of data is very, very wide. But here, TBI, it has been excellent performance where it is significantly able to differentiate between normal and a very asymmetric ectasia, and the median value is actually close to that of a KCI. So that is how significant TBI has been in this study. But just to provide a contrarian view before I close with this talk, is this is an eye, and this is not just the only example. I have several examples of these patients. One eye, absolutely normal, very thick corneas, completely normal bad D. CBI is normal, is at 0, TBI is at 0.07, everything is completely normal, but the other eye has frank and probably advanced keratoconus. So we are still a way off as far as differentiating this is concerned, and there are still some cases which the TBI continues to miss. How about decision making? Has it really changed the way I choose my refractive procedure? This was a patient which I saw today. I just included these slides while Dr. Jaya was talking. And this is a patient with a significant IS asymmetry, 1.8 diopter. Overall D is normal. We repeated the scan multiple times to ensure that the scans were taken properly to rule out a decentered apex syndrome. This is again the other eye which also had a significant IS asymmetry, and the overall D was normal. I tried to look at the CBI and TBI. The CBI is also normal, TBI is also normal. Now this patient has a -8 diopter sphere and -1 diopter cylinder. So would anyone, considering the fact, despite seeing the significant IS asymmetry, be brave enough to do a SMILE or LASIK or a surface ablation procedure? I went on to advise this patient a phakic IOL. Has this biomechanics made a difference in my clinical practice in the way I select my procedure or choose my procedures? Honestly, as of today, I don't think it has made a significant difference. Yes, it is a step in the right direction. Yes, it is a step in the direction where we are wanting to head towards, in the sense we are wanting to have 0 cases of iatrogenic ectasia and rule out even the smallest cases of FFKC. But in the normal cases, where I have a doubt in the pentacam, the CBI or TBI are corroborative evidence, but not making a huge difference altogether. Brilliant microscopy has been around for the last 10-15 years. We've been hearing about it over so many lectures. I had the privilege of seeing this firsthand and seeing it being used firsthand in Professor Seiler's hospital. Brilliant microscopy is really useful, that it measures the individual layers, that it does not just look at the cornea as a whole like all our AirPuff devices do. And this has been the only device which has been able to differentiate the strength between a cross-linked and a non-cross-linked cornea, and also differentiate between the anterior part of the cross-linked cornea versus the posterior part of the cross-linked cornea as compared to the controls. So we have a plethora of new investigations, and early diagnosis is extremely important, and which will help us to make timely and appropriate interventions. Thank you so much for the kind attention and the opportunity as well.
Thanks, Dr. Shreyas. You very beautifully enumerated the use of Corvus in our daily practice. My one question to you is that if you get a very clear pentacam with absolutely normal D values, bad display, absolutely normal, but still your TBI, CBI values are little on the suspicious side, would you actually go ahead and do a refractive surgery, or you would rather just eliminate the case from your book, considering this refractive?
As of today, I have been doing these cases, sir. So when the pentacam is absolutely normal and it is only the C. So essentially one thing which has to be, which I maybe didn't mention in my talk, is Corvus is fairly specific, but not very sensitive. So because it's not very sensitive, you may have an occasional case where the CBI is high. But what we don't want is the converse, that is a borderline pentacam or a slightly abnormal pentacam where the CBI is normal. That is what actually throws us off. So our aim here is to really try and include as many patients for refractive surgery and not exclude them. So as of today, when I see an absolutely normal pentacam and just a CBI being abnormal, I don't change the way I practice surgery, and I go ahead and advise as I would if I saw a normal pentacam.
And another just a question which just came to my mind after your answer, that whether in such cases, do you feel that it is better to change our ideas of going a conventional LASIK to changing them to a surface ablation, thinking in terms of the CBI, TBI values?
Certainly, sir. I mean, what I'm trying to say is when we have a borderline KC, not borderline KC, borderline tomography, but we see CBI and TBI also abnormal, that definitely makes me shift towards a surface ablation if it is a lower power, or a phakic IR if it is a higher power. But definitely that is agreed. But if I'm seeing an absolutely normal pentacam, good thickness, but just the CBI being abnormal, it has still not changed the way I practice. I still go ahead and do a SMILE or a femtolasic procedure or a Contura procedure as per the patient's requirement. We've been doing it. We've had this device for the past 7 years. I have not yet come across a patient who has developed ectasia where the pentacam is absolutely normal and only the CBI is abnormal. I'm yet to come across such a case, sir.
Okay. I believe your last line gives the answer for all the queries in our mind. So thank you. Now moving on to Dr. Ramendra Bakshi, who will be talking about the surface ablation. I will say lovely concept and the way to go in refractive surgery.
Good evening, everyone. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, sir.
I wish to thank Dr. Piyush and Dr. Jaya for making me a part of this IC. So I'll be talking about one of the oldest techniques of refractive surgery, which is surface ablation. So as refractive surgeons, we often come across this big dilemma of whether to perform a PRK, that is a surface ablation, or a LASIK in a particular scenario. And we all are well aware that LASIK has become one of the most popular corneal refractive surgeries because it gives us a very good post-operative outcome, a wow factor to the patient. The visual rehabilitation is fast compared to a PRK, in which obviously the patient has more post-operative discomfort. Nevertheless, the possibility of sight-threatening complications associated with the stromal flap in LASIK, and there are higher chances of ectasia. And with the advent of newer modifications in the surface ablation technique, this has led to a renewed interest in these techniques of late. Like Dr. Piyush was saying that PRK was first introduced by Marguerite McDonnell et al. In 1988. Unfortunately, the popularity rapidly faded when LASIK was popularized in the late 1990s because it offered a faster visual rehabilitation. And as of now, again, there's a renewed interest, resurgence of PRK. Most of the refractive surgeons are now opting for more of the PRK in their practice, especially in cases when there is a suspicious topography, there's a thin cornea, eyes with the basement membrane dystrophy, and it has been shown to be safe and effective and quite predictable in low to moderate myopia. A Cochrane review of PRK versus LASIK has showed that obviously LASIK had a faster visual recovery, but the final uncorrected visual acuity was comparable in both the scenarios, and there was not much difference in the visual acuity. Indications of PRK, like I said, thin corneas, suspicious corneas, in combination with cross-linking, like as in the Athens protocol, sometimes we do that. Like these topographies, when you have a little borderline pachymetry, you have a little suspicious anterior float in the bag, or you have in the anterior curvature map something which is not looking that great, you would definitely want to go in for a surface ablation procedure rather than a LASIK. And obviously it's economical both for the surgeon and the patient because there is no use of the microkeratome. So it's basically cost effective for both the patient and the surgeon. The advantages over LASIK because there's no flap, so obviously the corneal biomechanics is not interfered with, and it maintains the stability of the cornea, and hence there is less liability of ectasia, and more residual bed is left, and it can be taken up for borderline corneas, and the suction ring is not applied, so the posterior segment is safer here. Now, while selecting the patient, we need to take a proper history of collagen vasculars, autoimmune diseases such as rheumatoid arthritis, SLE, Sjogren syndrome, because there could be unpredictable corneal wound healing with the potential for corneal melting also at times. And you need to take a proper history of keloid formation in the body. and prior HSV, because sometimes while applying laser excimer laser on these herpetic scars, there could be a recurrence of the HSV keratitis. So we need to be very sure that sometimes these nebular scars, we shouldn't be very aggressive with these patients. Yes, I can do a PRK in this patient because it has a nebular scar. So need to take a proper history. For patients with basement membrane dystrophy, that is map.fingerprint dystrophy, PRK is a technique of choice because it enhances the epithelial adhesion, whereas the microkeratome friction in LASIK may cause a frank epithelial defect in such cases. Patients with narrow palpebral aperture, small eyes, a prominent brow ridge, sometimes placing the suction ring could be very difficult. So in such cases, PRK becomes a technique of choice. Now the question arises, how much myopia can I treat with the PRK? Most of the studies have seen, and we have seen that with the higher degrees of myopia, there is an increased severity of haze and loss of BCVA, which is one of the disadvantages of doing PRK in higher myopia. There is increased chance of regression also and less likelihood of getting a good vision, that is 20/40 or better. But however, no consensus has been reached in most of the studies, but still a lot of studies have agreed that, that it is unacceptable procedure for myopia for more than 6 diopters. Sealer et al. Have found that the presence of scar tissue in 1% of the eyes that did not exceed 6 diopters, and in as high as 17% of the eyes, the PRK haze and the scarring was found when the treatment was more than 6 diopters. And Bronson et al. Have found out that with the ablation depths of greater than 80 microns produced higher levels of haze with decreased visual acuity than ablations less than 80 microns. So usually we set our upper limit as 6 diopters while treating the refractive error -6. And we need to see that the ablation depth should be more than 80 microns when we are doing a PRK. And in smaller diameter ablations, the corneal subepithelial haze is more. This is a confocal microscopy photograph of a virgin cornea, the first picture, whereas the second picture is treated eye after surface ablation post-op around 6 weeks. And you can see there is no scattering of the light because of the myofibroblast proliferation. The nuclei, the cell bodies, and the dendritic processes are all scattering light, and because of which the opacity develops, the subepithelial scarring develops in such patients. This is basically because of the myofibroblast proliferation. The keratocytes, they become converted into myofibroblasts. What is the role of mitomycin C? Mitomycin C is an alkylating agent. It has cytotoxic and antimitotic properties. It reduces the myofibroblast repopulation after surface ablation and therefore reduces the risk of postoperative corneal haze. We use it both prophylactically, intraoperatively while doing the procedure, as well as sometimes it is also used therapeutically when a patient comes to us with a haze to treat pre-existing haze. There is no definite evidence how much what is the diopter limit or what is the ablation depth at which we need to apply mitomycin C. So there is no definite cutoff, but usually in my practice, less than 3 diopters, I don't use mitomycin. If the refractive error is more than 3 diopters, then definitely I would like to go in for mitomycin. The concentration that is generally used is 0.02%. However, some studies have shown that for lesser myopias, less than 6 diopters, even 0.002% or 0.01% is also effective. And this dose of mitomycin C is very safe and we don't see many side effects with this dose of mitomycin C. What is transepithelial PRK? It is a procedure in which the epithelium is first removed by PTK followed by PRK in a single step with the excimer laser. And the size of the PTK treatment zone is aligned with the PRK ablation zone. So basically the healing is faster because the epithelial defect which is created is very, very precise and it is not big. And an eye tracker is active throughout the entire procedure. So Wavefront Optimize software is used to create the ablation profile. The epithelial defect which is created with the streamlight with the PTK treatment is 7 millimeters for myopia and 9 millimeters for mixed myopic astigmatism. And the laser ablation profile is basically usually kept at 6.5. You can see the clear-cut margins of the PTK treatment when the streamline treatment is done, transepithelial PRK. The first picture shows with the streamlight, the epithelial defect created versus the mechanical blunt spatula or the Amoyle's brush. So this is a video. It's a very fast procedure. It's a one-step, single-step procedure in which the epithelium is removed as well as a laser ablation is done. You can see this is a 9mm zone because it's a mixed myopic astigmatism. So large zone is created, very smooth and very precise. And now the central area is being treated 6.5mm for the correction of the PAR. And it's a very fast and smooth process. The post-op recovery is fast. Patient is very comfortable. So this is a study which compared the conventional PRK versus the transepithelial PRK. They selected 200 eyes in which 100 eyes underwent the transepithelial PRK versus 100 eyes which underwent the conventional PRK, and they found the visual recovery was faster in eyes with transepithelial PRK. Because the epithelial defect healed faster in such eyes, and the post-operative comfort was also better. Whenever we are doing an enhancement, we need to be sure whether the residual refraction is basically because of the epithelial hyperplasia, or whether it is because of the regression, or whether it is because of the. So can I continue for a minute, sir? So basically, we need to be sure that it's because of the initial undercorrection or whether it's because of the regression. And sometimes the regression could be because of the epithelial hyperplasia, and when we are doing an enhancement in such cases, there could be an overcorrection. So we need to be sure about that. Other problems with PRK could be a persistent defect, infection, regression, slow rehabilitation, scar formation. This is a picture of a haze. This is scar formation. Sometimes, very rarely, there could be an infection because of a persistent epithelial defect. How do we avoid haze? Preoperatively, mitomycin C. Intraoperatively, mitomycin C. Preoperatively, ask thoroughly about the healing of the wounds. Sometimes the haze responds to an increase in the frequency and intensity of steroids. Low-dose steroids can be continued for up to 3 months post-op. Sometimes PTK with mitomycin C can be performed. Reablation should be delayed for at least 6 months. The refraction is often inaccurate and overestimates the amount of myopia in the presence of haze. Sometimes systemic vitamin C also helps in reducing the haze. Concluding, PRK is a safe, effective and predictable technique for the correction of low to moderate myopia, astigmatism and low hyperopia. The disadvantages are post-operative discomfort, length of the time required for visual recovery and increased haze. Wound modulating agents such as mitomycin C are expanding the range of treatable refractive errors. And this is a treatment of choice in patients with basement membrane dystrophy and thin corneas. And transepithelial PRK leads to faster visual recovery and lesser post-op discomfort. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Raminder, for enumerating the first and the basic step in keratorefractive surgery, that is the surface ablation. And in fact, it remains the procedure of choice for me as well. Without wasting time, I would request Dr. Rajiv Bajaj to continue and enumerate the various other methodologies in keratorefractive surgeries, talking about a comparison between LASIK and SMILE. To you, sir.
Am I audible?
Yes, sir, audible.
Thank you, Dr. Jaya, and thank you, Dr. Piyush, for inviting me to this session. I'll be talking about some basic concepts of PRK, LASIK, and SMILE, and the current evidence. As much. Yeah.
Slide show कर लीजिए.
उत्कर्ष पीछे नहीं आ रहा. Slide आगे नहीं बढ़ रही.
So you to make it full screen first.
Full screen. Full screen हो गया.
Slideshow.
So as Dr. Ramendra has very elaborately described about PRK. It is the laser refractive procedure used to correct these refractive errors. Was developed by Dr. Stephen Trockel and got an FDA approval in 1996. Here the indications are up till 12 diopters of myopia, and it can treat an astigmatism up to 6 diopters and hyperopia up to 5 diopters. As she's just said, the higher chances of regression and haze with higher errors, and reasons why PRK may be desirable over other surgical options are it's not a flap-based surgery. These patients who are reluctant to undergo a flap-based procedure, it's a better procedure from them. It's better procedure in certain professions like athletes, pilots, army personnel, boxers, swimmers. And of course, in where LASIK is contraindicated, like especially in thinner corneas, epithelial anterior basement membrane dystrophies, history of recurrent corneal erosions, anteriorly placed scleral buckles after post-RD surgery, and very flat and very steep corneas. It is a procedure of choice also as an enhancement procedure to correct residual refractive errors following refractive surgery itself, following SMILE, following LASIK, and following cataract surgery, especially after multifocal IOLs. So when the patients are not very much satisfied, absolute contraindications remain the same as of all of the refractive surgeries, especially the keratoconus and atretic disease of the cornea, uncontrolled dry eyes, blepharitis, extreme vascularization, and active connective tissue disorders. So these are some of the relative contraindications. If cornea is mildly abnormal corneal topography, some may do PRK with a collagen cross-linking also. And some have done with significant irregular astigmatism, healed herpes simplex virus keratitis, uncontrolled controlled diabetes, and drugs like amiodarone, isotretinoin, which is a vitamin A prodrug. Long-term visual outcomes after PRK are excellent. In a study with a 15 years follow-up, 55% of the eyes were within plus minus 1 diopters, and 85% of the eyes at 15 years of the study were within plus minus 2 diopters. If you compare it with LASIK, reviews have demonstrated there is no differences in long-term efficacy, accuracy, or adverse outcomes, any eyes which were lost due to mild to moderate myopia. And though LASIK has a shorter recovery time with lesser postoperative pain, there is a higher incidence of haze in PRK than LASIK. There is no comparison for hyperopia in literature for PRK versus LASIK. Mitomycin C is most of the time applied along with I apply mitomycin C in each and every case, whether it's 1 diopter or it's 6 diopters. I personally have done up till 7.5 diopters with the mitomycin C application for almost 35 to 40 seconds. And till now, all my patients are doing very well. I have not seen even a single haze so far in PRK. Mitomycin C acts by preventing corneal haze, and complications, infection always remain a risk. Sterile infiltrates are often seen sometimes in post-PRK. Decentrations, erosions, and persistent refractive error may be found. Ectasia it's very rare following PRK. One study which have studied all the ectasias post-PRK, they noted that all the patients were having a pre-existing underlying keratoconus. Next. LASIK is laser assisted in situ keratomelius. I'll enumerate the basic things. It's a widely accepted procedure as one of the best elective surgical procedure performed on the human body. Got an FDA approval in 1998, and it's FDA approved up till minus 14 diopters of myopia and hyperopia and astigmatism up to 6 diopters. Has a post-operative dissatisfaction rate of only 1%. That's a very big thing for any procedure. And another marker of post-operative success in visual acuity was recorded in PROWL studies. PROWL is patient-reported outcomes with LASIK. PROWL 1 study found that uncorrected visual acuity of 20/20 are better in more than 97.5% of the eyes. Basics, if you talk about the basics, it consists of 2 steps: stromal flap creation and tissue laser ablation of stromal ablation. Average laser flaps are around 100 to 110 microns, and a common residual bed thickness is around 300 microns left, with more aggressive surgeons approaching 250 microns. Amongst the LASIK advances, wavefront guided, wavefront optimized, and topography guided LASIKs have come recently. In wavefront guided LASIK, wavefront aberrometers, they allow to pass a beam of light through the eye, and then with the eye, the beam reflects back from the cornea. It is taken, and that is the patient's wavefront. This wavefront guided LASIK has an advantage that it can treat higher order aberrations like coma, trephine, and spherical aberrations. In wavefront optimized LASIK, this theoretically bypasses the individual's aberrometry with the goal of creating wavefront using age-matched knot and algorithms. This wavefront optimized LASIK helps to maintain corneal asphericity, that is prolate shape of the cornea, and minimizes induced spherical aberration, laser aberrations. Topography guided LASIK Contura has become so popular these days. It collects corneal data from the cornea using a Placido's disc topographer, and it measures the irregular corneas. LASIK contraindications, I'll skip, you know all. It's time to smile. So SMILE is an acronym for small incision lenticular extraction, and more than 3 million procedures have been performed worldwide so far. It uses a low energy femtosecond laser and is developed by Carl Zeiss. SMILE got an FDA approval in 2016. It's approved for 1 to 10 diopters of myopia and up to 3 diopters of cylindrical power minus for myopia and myopic astigmatism with a total spherical equivalent to 11 diopters. SMILE combines the advantages of PRK and RK, and it is a flapless procedure. It has a quick LASIK-like results with an additional benefits of no post-operative restrictions. These are the indications of SMILE within -5 to 12 diopters of spherical equivalent and 5 diopters. It can treat up to 5 diopters of astigmatism, but though FDA approval is still 3 diopters of astigmatism. Absolute contraindications remain the same for all keratorefractive surgeries. This is the video. Should skip the video. I'll show you the video in the last. The current evidence of the SMILE shows that it is equally efficacious, equally predictable, and stable. So many studies have done so far. A 5-year follow-up retrospective study showed that SMILE and LASIK in correcting myopia and myopic astigmatism, both were equal. In another study, SMILE provided a predictable and stable correction of moderate to high myopia, and there were no changes in spherical ligament post-op up till 4 years. Again, all these studies, they compare SMILE with LASIK, and they are found SMILE to be equally good to LASIK. Advantages of LASIK, advantages of SMILE, it gives a smaller incision, it's flapless, no intraoperative or postoperative flap problems. SMILE may be a potentially better biomechanically stable procedure because SMILE spares the anterior corneal lamellar tissue, especially if it is done within 130, less than the cap, you keep it more than 130 microns, you spare the anterior lamellar tissue, and it makes the cornea stronger. A study again which has looked into the corneal hysteresis and corneal resistance factor found that SMILE preserved the corneal biomechanical strength better than LASIK, and it has a definite advantage in preserving the nerves of the cornea, and fewer dry eye symptoms are experienced with SMILE as compared to LASIK. There are even lesser higher induced aberrations, though both the procedures LASIK and SMILE induce higher order aberrations. And after 3 months, it has been studied that higher order aberrations are lesser in SMILE as compared to LASIK. Since it's single platform surgery, you don't have to shift patients from femto laser to excimer laser. And effective functional zone, post-operatively, it has been measured that it's significantly larger in SMILE as compared to femtosecond laser-based surgery. Some disadvantages are there. It can't correct more than 5 diopters of astigmatism, and till now there is absence of any mechanism to compensate for cyclotorsion. Though in the newer versions of SMILE, we would be getting that also. If there is a gross decentration during docking, it may lead to visually disabilitating aberrations. And visual recovery in SMILE is a bit slower and as compared to femto-LASIK, though finally, after about a week or so, both are equal, and patients have to really be counseled about any to prevent any unnecessary anxiety. Amongst the complications, may I continue? Hello? Hello?
Yes, I think you can continue.
May I continue?
Dr. Ritin has not.
Okay,
yes,
okay.
Yes, we have time.
So amongst the SMILE complications, first thing which I saw that you have a slightly longer learning curve. Until you do around 5-10 cases, you can encounter complications. There could be suction loss during the procedure, a decentration of the or treatment, incision tear, a cap perforation, retained denticule with a difficult dissection, opaque bubble layer created by the femtosecond laser, uncut areas of the lens of the lenticules, which are called black spots, lenticle adherence to the cap. If you separate the lenticle posterior first, and then the anterior part of the lenticle that gets attached to the cap, then it's difficult to remove it. There could be a bleeding at the incision sites and epithelial defects. All these complications, though very rare, they have been reported in 1% of the patient, which is pretty high figure, I suppose. But still, it is a new procedure. Surgeons are learning these things. Amongst the post-operative complications, DLK, it's a bit higher in the smile. Ectasia, though it's very, very rare. Post-operative dry eye rare, and as compared to LASIK, undercorrections and overcorrections may happen. Infection may happen to any surgery. Situations where smile are preferred over LASIK, especially those people who want to play contact sports, who want to go into army, who are boxers, who are swimmers, any patients who have worn contact lenses for a prolonged years of time because they are prone to dry eye, patients with mild dry eye disease, and smile has shown a higher stability in high myopia versus LASIK. Situations in where PRK and LASIK is preferred over smile. As Dr. Ramendra has elaborated, epithelial basement membrane dystrophy, opacities because a femtosecond laser won't pass through the opacity. A microkeratome can pass through an opacity. Hyperope smile is not able to do hyperopic correction till now. Patients with higher wavefront aberrations and topographic irregularities. Here, wavefront guided LASIK is supposedly better as compared to smile. And it's a preferred choice in large angle kappas because in these patients, there can be a chance of cone decentration during smile docking. Extra procedures can be combined with all of the three things. It can be combined with the PRK, it can be combined with LASIK or smile. And still, current literature suggests that refractive procedures and simultaneous cross-linking is generally safe, but it does not deliver better results if you are doing it with the refractive procedures alone. And still unclear about the benefits of combining with cross-linking. Long-term studies are needed to evaluate these beneficial results of cross-linking with these procedures, and more research is needed to titrate the UVA irradiation settings for the optimal outcome. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Very well enumerated, Dr. Bajaj.
So I skipped most of the studies. There was hardly any time to, I would have elaborated some studies.
I believe all the studies, we would just value your experience more than the studies, sir.
Thank
so
you.
Coming down to your experience and the experience of most of the panelists,
yes,
I would just like to ask you all one single question.
Yes.
What is your take, each of you individually, on this? Now, your cousin wants to get a refractive surgery done through you, has a power of -6 or about a 6.5 diopter. The topography is quite fine.
Yeah.
And now the person does not bother about the pain or, any kind of a time duration or whatever. He is comfortable the way he or she wants and says the entire thing rests on you. So what is the procedure of choice in your experience?
See, if the patient...
If
the patient is not very anxious, I will prefer to do a smile. Because over the last 2 years, I have been performing smile and I have seen the results. My results are, if not better than my microkeratome LASIK or femto LASIK. Smile has a definite advantage. The patients are very comfortable the next day.
So now one single twist in this question. I would say that the pachymetry is 490.
Yes.
So what now?
Even then, I would. And that actually depends on the number you have. What is the refractive power?
I said a refractive spherical equivalent of about a -6.5.
Okay, then I would prefer a PRK.
Okay.
At 490.
And if the thickness is, say, about a 530?
Smile.
Okay.
I treated a patient of 509 microns with 6.75 spherical and 1.75 cylinder at 180. So I've done smile at 509.
Okay. So My next question, I would value the experience of Shreyas the most.
Yes.
So what do you say, dear?
Sir, fake IOL, sir. Any day. If it's my
IOL.
cousin especially, and I have to keep seeing him for years together, I want a procedure where I don't have to worry about regression. And the incidence of regression post any of these procedures is almost similar. Smile, some studies have reported slightly better or slightly lower regression than PRK or LASIK, but we've not seen it in our series, sir. We've done almost 8,000 cases of Smile now, but I definitely don't see any change in the incidence of regression. Ectasia is lesser, but then that's also because our screening criteria have become more stringent. And whenever in doubt, we are switching over to phakic IOLs nowadays. So 6.75 or 6.5 diopter power, my cousin, I would definitely say phakic IOLs.
Dr. Raminder, your take on it?
Sir, I would go in for a Smile procedure at 490. I've never seen regression even with excimer laser. I've done thousands of LASIKs during the past. I have a follow-up of around, say, 6 to 7 years. I have not seen much of regression. Hardly there's any regression with Allegretto Wavelight 500. It's a very good machine. And
you said Smile, I believe.
Yeah, yes, but I was talking about regression. So I think either femtosecond laser or Smile, any of the two procedures I can go in for. But Smile, obviously, because of better biomechanics and there's no flap and it's a borderline cornea, so Smile, and it's a relative, so obviously better post-op of comfort will be there. And then the second option would be to go in for a PRK, if not Smile.
My question to Raminder is that what deters you from doing an ICL in this patient? Why would you hesitate? Yes.
ICL, obviously it's an intraocular procedure, so that would always be my second choice. So as long as I'm okay with the surface procedure, I would go for it.
And Dr. Jaya, you?
I don't do ICL, but my preferred choice would be ICL.
Okay.
Less than 500 microns, I would not like to do refractive.
May I add something?
Please, sir, please.
See, we have to see per case as far as medico-legal issues are also concerned. If it is a documented cornea of less than 500 microns, I think medico-legally it is unsafe to touch these procedures. If you're doing PRK, it's okay. If you're doing a flap-based procedures, then somehow here or there a medico-legal, if ectasia happens, then medico-legal issues would arise, even if the pentacam and everything is normal. Though I agree it would be rare, but some medico-legal issues may arise.
I think 490 is the cutoff limit for doing Smile. Less than that, I will not touch
if you read the literature from Smile people, they have put the cutoff limit as 500 microns.
Yes.
And Shreyas, what do you say that if we are not opting for a phakic IOL, if we want to do a keratorefractive procedure, which is the procedure of choice in that case for you?
So in that case, Smile more because of the the initial post-operative comfort and sorry, sir.
Even more than a surface ablation like a PRK.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I mean, in the sense, I don't have any restriction with regards to power for PRK. I've done PRK for -8, -10 also, and with mitomycin C, it works extremely well. But having said that, definitely with Smile, the initial postoperative comfort is better. We did a contralateral eye study of comparing Smile with Contura in each eye, sir. And while the visual results were all similar, what every patient was blinded. They did not know which eye had undergone Smile, which eye had undergone Contura LASIK. Every one of them, when asked a leading question, said that the eye where they had undergone Smile, or at least the eye which they pointed to where actually Smile had been done, they were more comfortable. They had no foreign body sensation. They had no irritation. And this was true at 1 day, 1 week, and up to 1 month. After 1 month, they could not find the difference. But up to a month, definitely the comfort level is better. And visual recovery is another thing which we often talk about. And there are a lot of papers which have said that the visual recovery in SMILE is slower than that of femto-LASIK or excimer treatment. Unfortunately, I think that is something which is differing from machine to machine. I think SMILE is still a technology in its infancy. More and more companies will come up with it, whereas excimer is a much more mature technology. And the SMILE, when the energy parameters have been optimized appropriately, the visual recovery is just as good as femto-LASIK on day one.
I believe this is the concept, because many of the SMILE users who have been found a little unhappy, or they have seen that their patients did not recover a good vision, the energy optimization had been an issue in their machines.
Yes, sir.
So definitely. But somehow I believe that every surgeon has his or her own choice, of course. And I am a true lover of surface ablation, and I generally like even most of my patients who love to get a surface ablation and who don't mind the time limits, I love to do a surface ablation. Of course, I do not have an access to SMILE. I don't do SMILE that often, but I have shifted my choice from LASIK to a surface ablation more often, especially after the introduction of transepithelial PRK.
Yes, sir.
So they were the next. Actually, Dr. Ritin has not joined with us. So the next thing I would.
You can do two things. Shreya said that he's willing to give us some talk on Contura.
Yeah, that's what. Let us request Shreyas that if he can just add on his ideas about Contura, the hype versus the reality.
Yes, sir. Would you want me to go last, sir, so that depending on the time available, would you like to complete your talk?
That will be better. Dr. Piyush, I think you can finish your talk, and then Shreyas can.
Okay.
Depending on the time available, I can make it shorter or longer.
Sure. Then I would just begin with my talk.
So Dr. Piyush's talk is about LASIK versus ICL, I think decision making.
I have been doing ICL for the past almost now 13 years with a experience of almost about 4,000 plus patients. And yes, I would say that as we were just discussing previously, ICL is a wonderful procedure and it has stood the test of time. Talking about a comparison between laser vision correction and the ICL in the current scenario, I would first like to specify that every surgeon must understand that the cornea has got a specific shape. It's an aspheric one with no specific edges and a mean keratometry of 43 diopters. But whenever we are doing any kind of a myopic ablation, we tend to flatten the head of it and create new edges with a sharp margin. Now, this gives rise to various issues, and that is why I would say that reshaping the cornea has to have some limits. The limits have to be specific, that whenever we are doing a myopic correction, we should not try and exceed more than an 8 diopter, and in a hyperopic, maybe up to 4 or 5 diopter maximum. With the stromal residual bed, though the theory says about 250 microns, but in my practice, I have never left a bed of less than 300 microns. The corneal curvature should always be try and maintained between a 33 to 47 diopters, and the optical zone should be optimized with the pupil diameter as much as in the myopic, mesopic condition. We cannot actually change the shape and the thickness of cornea indefinitely, and especially when we are treating a high ametropia, we must always keep this thing in our mind, because if we are heading towards a keratorefractive surgery, we may encounter regression and a reduced quality of vision. Regression, as was being previously discussed, is an issue whenever we are treating very high ametropias. And of course, the main thing why the patient is getting the surgery done is the quality of vision. Quality of vision is quite excellent up to about a 5 diopters, but there is a little compromise when we go between a range of 5 to 8 diopters, but quite unsatisfactory in cases of more than 8 diopters or those of high myopia. Various techniques have come up in the evolution of LASIK, like wavefront ablation, aspheric ablations, and whatnot, which have improved the quality of vision, but mind it, nothing has changed the basic of corneal behavior. And when we ever try to exceed the guidelines, we may encounter disasters like corneal ectasia, which nobody, of course, would ever like to see in his or her patient, severe glare and halos, which may be surely very bothersome, and even a loss of line in their best corrected visual acuity. So that is why I always say LASIK in high ametropia is in fact always an unfulfilled promise. So be careful whenever we are treating high ametropias and look for other options like a phakic IOL. Why so? Because the procedure has a high predictability. It gives a stability of refraction, preserves the accommodation, and there is no loss of visual acuity. And in fact, we tend to gain a visual acuity because most of the patients, even I have seen in very high myopes who have been termed as amblyopes, they have gained a vision from 1 to 2 lines after a good ICL procedure has been done for them. So when a phakic IOL? What guidelines I generally follow in my practice, if the pachymetry is fine, the topography is good, I generally would prefer a LASIK up to about an 8 or a 9 diopter, of course, depending upon the pachymetry results. And beyond that, always a choice remains of a phakic IOL. While treating hyperopia, I have in fact practically never gone in much for the phakic IOLs because to find the right patient for it with a good AC depth is generally unusual as the eyes are short. But what the theory says is that beyond a 4 to 5 diopters, if the AC depth allows, it is better to go in for a phakic IOL. So is phakic IOL an option or a replacement for LASIK? I believe as the time is evolving, as our experience is growing, it is in fact becoming a replacement for LASIK. As I was discussing a case previously, where Dr. Shreyas immediately pointed out that he would not want a regression in the patient and he would actually not want any risk of ectasia. So he would choose a phakic IOL if the patient is his own relative and having a refractive error as good as only -6, where he could even choose a keratorefractive procedure. So why is it so? It is so because now phakic IOLs allow us to treat higher refractions. It's a reversible procedure. There are no structural changes which are being induced in the cornea or the eye per se. It does not induce any higher order aberration. The quality of vision thus is quite good and there is improvement, improvement in the best corrected visual acuity. The issues of dry eye do not remain. It is a reversible procedure. The best part is that ever anything goes wrong, it is a reversible procedure, unlike the keratorefractive procedures, and the flexibility for other procedures remain. The flexibility means that just a day before, a patient was asking me that agar mera number vapis aa gaya, then what? And I told the patient because there was a good cornea, it was about a 500 micron, but the patient had about a refractive error of -9 or so. I told that even if there is a refractive change, I can always go ahead and do a bioptics or a surface ablation on this patient later, even after doing a phakic IOL. So what do we generally need in these patients? We need a stable refraction. We do not want any intraocular disease like diabetes, retinopathy, and especially the things like uveitis. And mind it, it is even a choice in a patient with ectatic disorders like keratoconus. And in our practice, many of our patients of keratoconus have been treated with phakic IOLs after their cornea has been stabilized through C3R.
Have my program coming at 5:30.
So some specific issues which are required or which are to be looked into while treating a patient of phakic IOL is that you should look at the anterior chamber anatomy. The AC depth has to be adequate. It should be more than a 2.8. The endothelium profile has to be good. And generally, I follow up all my patients for their endothelial profile by getting a specular count done repeatedly after about 1 to 2 years, depending upon the patient's convenience. Iris shape should not be a convex one. The pupil size should not be too large so that it exceeds the optic zone of the IOL, which would actually cause a lot of glare and halos. And of course, a perfect surgery because it's an intraocular one. Here is an example of a surgery which I was doing as a live surgery in the last DOS meeting. I was implanting a toric IPCL, and in my practice, I have implanted all the available ones, phakic IOLs
Telling you like
from Appaswamy, from Care Group, Biotech, as well as the ICL. But the choice always remains that I love ICL ever better than the other lenses. But of course, IPCL has also picked up a lot in my practice. So here the implant is settled in the anterior chamber and the haptics are tucked beneath the iris. So there are, of course, like all procedures have their contraindications. There are contraindications with phakic IOLs as well. The main remains that the AC depth should not be less than a 2.8. Glaucoma is another factor which has to be looked into. And of course, the endothelial dystrophies involving the endothelial structure. But mind it, my friend, no surgery is foolproof. And phakic IOLs have also been giving me surprises, which are commonly seen in the form of sometimes a very high vault, like a case like this. It can be a low vault as low as a 157 micron and leading to an anterior subcapsular cataract, as in this. Again, though the cataract luckily has not been developed, but the vault is too low in this patient. And here, in spite of having a good vault, the patient developed anterior subcapsular cataract. But in my experience, I have seen that it is these issues of cataract or the anterior subcapsular issues or the vault issues were there in the previous generation, especially the Indian IOLs. But after the introduction of the central hole, I have yet to encounter any patient developing a cataract, and it has been long years after the hole has been introduced, and with the hole and the regular aqueous flow, the incidence of cataract has really come down. And the smart design with the present generation ICL and the IPCL, the vaulting attained is much perfect. So going on to various studies which talk about the issues which various surgeons in various studies have encountered, a small meta-analysis which gives us the problems of anterior subcapsular cataract surgery being done, pupillary block being occurring, or glaucoma. So in all these cases, if you tend to look, there is generally that the studies have been of very short duration, and one study which gives the maximum duration of 6.5 to 7 years shows that anterior subcapsular opacities have been maximum in this. So my friend, I think all of you would agree that the complications do not come soon. Whenever we are looking for a procedure and looking for how good the procedure is, we have to wait for the time and the time to ripe for it. In fact, I would say that minimum I have seen that a complication in a keratorefractive surgery to come, I have seen that it generally comes after a duration of 7 years. And most of my patients who have developed any complication in the form of ectasia or much of regressions have been at least after a follow-up of 5 to 6 years, until and unless some obvious cross entity has been missed on a topography. So how do we treat these complications? When we develop a high vault, we can always exchange with a smaller size of ICL. And when we have a low vault, we can always exchange with a larger one. There has been a patient in my experience in which I implanted a toric ICL. And somehow, in spite of implanting the largest available ICL size in these patients, there was a rotation, and always a rotation in the eye that ICL used to move. And we had to get a customized Indian IPCL made for that patient and replace it with that. And somehow his sulcus to sulcus anatomy was such that even the highest this length of the ICL could not suit his eye. I've already asked this question to the panelists, so I would just conclude my talk with this, and over to Dr. Shreyas to talk about his experience on quantum reduction. Thank you.
I would like to interrupt. We are running out of time. Can we please conclude this session quickly, because it's 5:25. We need to start another one.
So I believe we have a few minutes in which Dr. Shreyas can just brief up about his experience about Contura.
Sure, sir. Sure. Yeah.
So I'll keep it under 5 minutes, sir. So essentially, I mean, a very nice talk on, very comprehensive talk on phakic IOLs, and that is my favorite go-to option whenever in doubt. Just quickly sharing a few things about Contura and topo-guided LASIK. So with Contura LASIK, is there a lot of hype? Definitely yes, there is no doubt about it. But is this something we should just discard saying it is only hype? No, it is a topography guided treatment, and this topography guided LASIK has been around since 2003, and Contura is just a repackaged version of that. But it is definitely really worth looking into as compared to our wavefront optimized and wavefront guided. Main advantages being it is not limited by the pupil, the data which we are acquiring as compared to wavefront guided. It is a static measurement in the cornea. It's not dynamic like in wavefront guided. There are more measurement points. We get more peripheral data, and majority is from the cornea where we are measuring most of the higher order aberrations. But one thing we need to look into is that the astigmatism is not just in the anterior cornea. It is there in the posterior cornea. It is there in the higher order aberrations on the cornea. There is a component of internal astigmatism also. The reason why the FDA study, which showed 40% of one or more lines gained and was far better than any other platform, was essentially because they had very stringent criteria. They showed that anything more than 5 degrees of difference for a higher cylinder, they avoided, switched over to wavefront optimized. Anything more than 10 degrees of this thing, even in lower cylinders, they avoided. And in clinical practice, we will see that having a 5-degree difference between topography and subjective refraction is very, very common, very, very possible. And any patient who has even a moderate cylinder, a 5-degree is very likely. So to say that all these patients you will discard from topo-guided treatment and switch to wavefront optimized then doesn't serve the purpose of topography guide. The other extreme was Canalopolis' paper, where he showed that everything is topography guided. So if you had one diopter on subjective and the topography, the topolizer showed 3 diopters of cylinder, they would still go on to correct 3 diopters of cylinder, and that was TMR. This is what prompted us to do this study of SMILE versus TMR, and I will show just example very quickly. Patient having moderate astigmatism 1.75 and 2.75 underwent, it was a randomized control trial, right eye SMILE, left eye TMR based Contura LASIK. And in TMR, as I mentioned earlier, we correct the full cylinder which is measured without any correction. I mean, just wait for the algorithm. The post-operatively, just have a look. This patient has in the right eye which underwent SMILE has a 1.3 diopter cylinder on topography. The Contura looks pristine. Only 0.1 diopter of astigmatism on the topography. But if you look at the patient's refraction altogether, the patient had a 0.75 at 90. So essentially, it was an overcorrection which led on to flipping of the axis. So even though the topography was pristine, there was nil topographic cylinder, the patient was subjectively more happy in the SMILE eye. This was corroborated in other papers which showed that when there was a significant difference of axis between the manifest and the topography, the visual outcomes of topo-guided LASIK were poorer. So do we discard topo-guided LASIK? No. We need to develop better nomograms and newer nomograms. One of them is Forsides, and which looks into account where you're looking at the anterior corneal astigmatism which you get in the topolizer, the higher order aberration, as you can see in this case, the coma, which is adding on to the cylinder along that axis. And thirdly, you're looking at the posterior corneal astigmatism from the Scheimpflug device. And finally, you're also looking at the internal corneal astigmatisms. So by looking at all these, you actually bring about a proper vector analysis. And this vector analysis gives you the final power which you need to correct. And this will give us better results. We have an ongoing study now, which we are comparing Forsides versus Contura, and we are seeing superior and more consistent results with this. While Contura, to sum up, is an excellent platform. It is worthwhile. Topography guided LASIK is worthwhile doing, is worthwhile considering. But doing the right calculations and feeding in the right data is more important than just treating on the topography guided platform. That's the single take home message I wanted to give. Thank you so much, sir.
Very beautifully sum up and well in time. I really appreciate the way you speak. Brilliant. Brilliant. Truly
very
brilliant.
courteous to not let the session go waste. He spoke instead of Ritin.
I said that the only word for him is brilliant. The way he timed it and the way the gist he has given is absolutely perfect. Impress.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
So we must thank
So
all.
Thank you,
Thanks.
sir, for
Thank
the
you,
opportunity. Thank you, madam.
Thank you so
Really,
much.
really enjoyed the session. Thank you.
Thank you to all the speakers.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, doctors, on behalf of scientific committee team. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining in.
Thank you, Dr. Jaya. Thank you, Piyush. Bye.
Thank you,
Thanks a
madam.
lot.